Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy in the month of Ramu. Today we're going to take a look at the first of many games in this particular series, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. As you will see throughout this month, we have a plethora of games under this moniker, and we're going to take a look at them all. This is an incredibly noteworthy series, not just because it's good, but specifically this particular game ended a nearly decade-long spat between Square, now Square Enix, and Nintendo. Square had left Nintendo during the transition from the Super Nintendo to the 64 for the PlayStation, which provided a more relaxed game development environment and the use of CD technology rather than cartridges. So anyway, enough with the history lesson, let's get down to business about why Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is what it is. The game was released in 2003 on the Gamecube in Japan and early in 2004 in the Western regions. It was the launch of an independent Final Fantasy branch of the series. This game itself discarded the traditional turn-based Final Fantasy combat system for a more action RPG approach. This particular game also sported some features that could be only used on the GameCube at the time, which is kind of a detriment to the game, to be honest. This feature is the ability to play with 4 players simultaneously, and that's admittedly not a new thing, but this could only be achieved by using GameCube's special Game Boy Advanced adapters. While this game was generally praised, the forced function of this Game Boy Advanced requirements for multiplayer admittedly heavily detracted from what would be just an incredibly impressive multiplayer game. There's no way to play multiplayer on this without those Game Boy Advances. So just to speculate, now I cannot provide any kind of hard evidence on this, but just from what we know then and what we know now, I suspect that Nintendo themselves had a say in pushing this Game Boy Advance multiplayer adaptation nonsense. Perhaps they wanted to test the waters for maybe some kind of interesting off-screen play mechanics for ideas for maybe a particular system down the road? I don't know. I can't imagine the developers of this game pushing to have that very, very strict Game Boy Advance integration for multiplayer. So speaking of developers, let's talk about them. This game wasn't actually created by a proper Final Fantasy team over at Square Enix, but was instead developed by the Game Designers Studio, which itself was a shell corporation for Square Enix known as Development Division 2. Which was then rebranded as Taito Corporation in March 2006 after Square merged Taito with the Game Designers Studio. And if you can follow all that corporation merging nonsense, then that's great for you, because it took me a long time to wrap my head around it. Alright, so let's move away from developers and corporations and all that, and let's get to the game itself. So the features are quite a bit of a distinction between the mainline Final Fantasy games like I was talking about earlier. Square had been away from Nintendo for a very long time at this point, and many of the fans may not have played some of the more recent Final Fantasy games that came out on PlayStation, like 7, 8, 9, PlayStation 2's 10, and then 11 had actually been released by this time. So all of those games, other than 11, had taken a much kind of harder push towards integrating technology into the game and moving away from that specific pseudo-medieval kind of high fantasy feel of the games. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles seemed to acknowledge this, though I don't know if it was conscious or not, and they wanted to revert the game back to a very, very heavily inspired storybook fairy tale kind of aesthetic. It's really not too dissimilar from the direction that Seiken Densetsu, or the Mana series as we know it, were at the time. The direction with Crystal Chronicles was apparent right from the start. The world, the races, and just general tone and feel of the game were immediately realized. The game knew what it wanted to be and stuck to its decision, which is commendable. The game, for lack of a better word, has these Nintendoisms that are pretty apparent actually. HP has now hearts instead of numbers. The battle system's also much more fluid, being that it's completely based on action instead of the turn-based combat that many people equate Final Fantasy with. So specifically in the game, there are 4 completely new races presented here that's not seen anywhere else as far as I'm aware. We have the Clavets, which are your basic human, kind of all-around normal people race race that can do everything, fairly well. You have the Lilties, which are your warrior race, which in the past they have some kind of mining expertise. They are plant-like in appearance, but clearly they're kind of analogous to dwarves. You have the Selkie, which are fairly tall, lanky, they wear furs, and they're kind of a rugged race, and they're generally known as thieves. Now, they seem to be kind of like maybe an elf or elven gypsy kind of race, at least that's what they strike me as. And the last race is known as the Utes, which are tall, slender, and they have helmets covering their face most of the time. And they actually have little tiny wings that basically serve no purpose at all to the gameplay, but they are distinctly known for their helmets covering their faces, and they are your general magic type of race. Now, they probably were inspired to make this race from the Black Mage, at least the original Black Mage, which had their faces covered. They're interesting, and I really do think that it fits the world that it's in. Now, this game doesn't have proper classes. All of the races can do whatever they want to in combat, but clearly some are more adept at particular things. So the gameplay itself is actually similar to other role-playing games. You travel around an overworld map, you go into towns, talk with townsfolk, buy supplies, pretty much a standard fare. One other thing though that you may want to take note of if you're thinking about playing this game is that equipment is made from crafting supplies. So keep that in mind if you do decide to give this game a try. You don't just go into town and buy equipment. That actually kind of turned me off the first time. Now since then there's been games that are completely reliant on crafting. But back then, that was a pretty jarring effect playing a game like Magic in this game is deeply rooted in Final Fantasy lore. You have your Magicite, which basically allows you to cast the spells from familiar Final Fantasy isms with the and Aga names like Cura, Curaga, Fira, Firaga, that kind of thing. Different attacks can also be chained together in combat for various benefits with other subsystems to kind of round this out. There's a lot there. It's incredibly enticing to play it with multiplayer. Again, it kind of sucks that they had that multiplayer be only available for those who had the Game Boy Advance and the adapters. So as the setting goes, the world is actually saturated with this noxious gas known as miasma. Miasma is just a general term that you see in a bunch of different games actually, and the crystals protect from that gas for a time. So for this game, the crystals have to be replenished with this thing called myrrh. It's a liquid, and that's basically the premise of this game. You form a caravan known as a crystal caravan, and you go out and you find this myrrh liquid and bring it back to the towns, and you allow towns to keep surviving. It's a simple story, but it works. One added effect from this though is that the characters actually have to physically carry a smaller crystal around because it prevents this noxious gas, the miasma, from killing the characters. So you have this radius in which you can fight and do your work, while whenever you move on, somebody actually has to pick up that crystal and take it with them. This can be kind of annoying. Just keep that in mind as well. It is part of the game mechanics, and it ties into the story, which is fine. So as we wrap this episode up, I remember vividly getting this game and being extremely excited to finally play a Final Fantasy game again on a Nintendo system. I had, however, been with this series as it went to PlayStation, and I played all of the games up until then, and this was a really big shock to put this in and play the game that was presented to me. I didn't really follow the game before it came out. I knew there was a Final Fantasy game, but I didn't, really follow it. Initially, I did not like the game, but after you accept the idea that this really isn't a traditional Final Fantasy game, but its own thing, the game itself is really quite good if you take just a completely objective look at it, or as objective as you possibly can. And it's incredibly fun if you have friends to play it with. So admittedly, like I said, the huge drawback is that Game Boy Advance multiplayer tie-in, and I think that if they had ditched that, the game could have been much larger than it actually was and gained just an incredibly large audience. But if you have a GameCube, definitely check it out. It's fine just as a single player experience, and you don't have to have a Game Boy Advance for that. But if you have friends and have that ability to do that multiplayer with Game Boy Advance, you need to pick this up right now. Go stop watching this video, go and find the game ASAP, please. You will not regret it. But on the next time, during a year of Final Fantasy, we will be looking at Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates, released for the DS. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.